Dear listeners, in this close reading session, I will be discussing the second chapter of the preliminary part of the Basic Questions of Philosophy by Martin Heidegger. As in the previously recorded close reading sessions, I will be continuing to use the format of first reading a paragraph or two and then explaining the ideas or giving some background that is required to understand the ideas that are central to the read passages. Before we begin with the second chapter of the preliminary part, I will give a brief summary of the first chapter that we read in the last video. So in the first chapter, he's basically trying to give a preliminary account of what he thinks that philosophy is, and Heidegger does that by making the distinction between worldly knowledge or knowledge about things on the one hand that science is occupied with, and sovereign knowledge that philosophy is occupied with. And sovereign knowledge, he says, is immediately useless knowledge about the essence of things. So, in contrast, science is occupied with the world and is an effective way of dealing with beings, so that we can shape the world and live comfortable lives. While philosophy is useless knowledge about the essence of things that is somewhat, he says, reverse, a knowledge that leaps ahead, opening up new domains of questioning and aspects of questioning about the essence of things. So while science is occupied with the world and with things already present, philosophy is occupied with the essence of things not that are already, but the way in which things can be. And by dealing with these kinds of questions, one is also able to leap ahead, he says, and open new domains or try and catch a glimpse of different domains that have remained hidden. And now, in the second chapter, Heidegger is going to try and show why the question of truth is the basic question that is also the essence of the way in which we could reach the sovereign knowledge that philosophy might someday give us. The challenge for Heidegger is to show that the question of truth does not rest with the question of the correctness of an assertion, or that the correctness of an assertion is not the bottom line of truth in general and man's relation to truth. And Heidegger is gonna do this by showing how the tradition has not seen the essence of truth in general, and this is gonna be the main aim of the lecture course in general, but especially the task of the second chapter that I'll be reading now. Chapter 2. The question of truth as a basic question. Paragraph 4. Truth as a problem of logic, correctness of an assertion, distorts every view of the essence of truth. The two titles announce the task of our lectures in a double way, though without making it clear what the content of the discussion is to be. To learn that, let us take the subtitle as our point of departure. Accordingly, the course will be about logic. Traditionally, this is a discipline, a branch of philosophy, supposing that philosophy itself is taken as a discipline, which scholasticism divides into individual branches: logic, ethics, aesthetics, etc., each of which then encompasses a series of concomitant problems. The word in quotation marks serves to name questions that are no longer truly asked. They have been frozen as questions, and it is only a matter of finding the answer, or rather, modifying answers already found, collating previous opinions, and reconciling them. Such problems are therefore particularly prone to conceal genuine questions and to dismiss out of hand as too strange certain questions that have never yet been raised. Indeed, to misinterpret completely the essence of questioning. The so-called problems can thus readily usurp the place of the basic questions of philosophy. Such problems of philosophical learnedness then have, from the standpoint of genuine philosophy, this remarkable distinction that, under the impressive appearance of problems, they may summarily and decisively prevent real questioning. Now, this first paragraph is pretty straightforward, so I won't really get into it in too much detail. But what Heidegger is saying here basically is that dealing with philosophical problems, understood as problems that are bound and tied to a tradition of questioning, is not true questioning. And this is because one is only able to think along the lines and within the boundaries of the problems that are already present. And in that way, being totally bound to a tradition of questioning is not inducive for letting the matters speak for themselves and in that way reaching the essence of that which is. Now, if one is bound by the tradition and one does reach the essence of that which is, then this is only a form of accidental luck. Only when oneself has asked the basic question and has reached the essence of that which is, one could say that it has been reached for the sake of itself. And in that way, I think that Heidegger also wants to stimulate people to go beyond the tradition and not get stuck within these kinds of questions that people have been asking and dealing with within a rigid framework that has not gained its position by merit but more due to historical circumstances. Continuing on. What we intend to discuss here is just such a problem of logic, but that means we shall endeavor to go forthwith beyond the problem, the frozen question, and likewise beyond logic as a discipline of scholastically degenerated philosophical learnedness to a philosophical questioning that is basic, that penetrates into the ground. Yet we shall have to make the problems our point of departure, for only in this way can we see the traditional form of the question, and we shall put into question, but which also still rules us. Because what is traditional often has behind itself a very long past, it is not something arbitrary, but harbors in itself still the trace of an erstwhile genuine necessity. To be sure, such traces can only be seen once the traditional is set back upon its ground. We shall select a problem of logic behind which lies a hidden, still unasked basic question of philosophy. Logic is our abbreviated expression for logike episteme. That means knowledge about logos, understood as assertion. To what extent is the assertion the theme of logic, and how does the construction of this branch of philosophy result from it? Let us clarify this briefly so that the name logic does not remain an empty title. So here I would just like to make one brief remark, and namely that we see here that Heidegger makes a move on the one hand saying that the tradition is somehow rigid and asking a true question is very difficult once we're stuck inside this tradition of questioning in which every problem and every argument has already been established, and in which doing philosophy has become some form of dealing with the existing problems and making a collage, what he says, of the different arguments and doing some tiny adjusting here and making some small adjustments there. On the other hand, Heidegger says that we should not be completely ignorant of the tradition and that it harbors in itself some kind of necessity. And this is going to be important to keep in mind because Heidegger is going to start from the tradition and try and show how there is a hidden important necessity that once we see that necessity and once we move from there by questioning, we get to a more essential level of, in this instance, the question of truth. A nice way of putting this is saying that Heidegger is not trying to cast away the tradition, but that he is trying to appropriate it. And this is very close to something that he says in Sign Outside, which I'm not going to look up. But yeah, the basic spirit of the remark is that we need to start from the tradition and go beyond it. Reading on again. What provides the assertion, a statement of the kind, the stone is hard, the sky is covered, such a rank that it is made explicitly the object of a branch of knowledge, namely logic? The assertion asserts something about a being, that it is and how it is. In doing so, the assertion is directed to richten auf, the being, and if the assertion in its very asserting conforms to, sich richten nach, the being, and if what it asserts maintains this direction, Richtung, and on that basis represents the being, then the assertion is correct, richtig. The correctness of an assertion that is meant for us and is meant from time immemorial truth. The assertion is hence the seed and place of truth, but is also an untruth, falsity, and lies. The assertion is the basic form of those utterances that can be either true or false. It is not as a kind of utterance and not as a verbal structure, but as the seed and place of correctness, that is to say, of truth, that the assertion, the logos, is an eminent object of knowledge. Then again, as this place of truth, it claims special attention only because the truth and the possession of the truth attract exceptional interest. We seek the truth, we speak of the will to truth, we believe we possess the truth, we prize the value of the truth. The truth and its possession or non-possession are what make us uneasy, happy, disappointed, and only for that reason does the assertion, as the place of truth, receive basically a special attention. And, furthermore, only for that reason is there basically something like logic. I intentionally use the word basically since matters have been quite different for a long time now, and the situation has been precisely the opposite. For a long time there has been logic as a discipline of scholastic philosophy, and in fact precisely since the beginning of Plato's school, but indeed only since then. Because logic exists as the examination of logos, there is also the problem of truth. Truth taken as the distinctive property of logos. The problem of truth is therefore a problem of logic, or, as we say in more modern times, theory of knowledge. Truth is that value by which knowledge first counts as knowledge, and the basic form of knowledge is the judgment, the proposition, the assertion, the logos. Theory of knowledge is therefore always logic in the just mentioned essential sense. In the paragraph I just read, Heidegger makes the question of truth and its relation to logic the basic question that he is going to be dealing with in this lecture course. Additionally, he also gives a general characterization of what this problem is within traditional philosophy, and he says that the problem of truth and its relation to logic can be basically expressed by saying that truth lies in the correctness of an assertion, and that the whole discipline of logic is based around the idea that the seed of truth is only to be understood in relation to asserting and of the correctness of such asserting. Moving on. Even though it might sound exaggerated to say that the problem of truth exists as a problem because there is logic, and because this discipline is from time to time taken up once again and presented under a new veneer, nevertheless it remains undebated that since the time of Plato and Aristotle, the question of truth has been a question of logic. This implies that the search for what truth is moves along the paths and in the perspectives which were firmly laid down by the approach and the range of tasks of logic and its presuppositions. To mention only modern thinkers, this fact can easily be substantiated on the basis of the works of Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche, though it is certain that for these philosophers and in general for the entire tradition of Western philosophy, the question of truth is a mediation on thinking and logos, and hence is a question of logic, yet it would be completely superficial and falsifying to claim that these thinkers have raised the question of truth and consequently sought an answer to it, only because logic exists and logic insists on such a question. Presumably, the concern that led these thinkers to the question of truth was not merely the one of improving and reforming logic, but precisely that interest every man has in the truth. Man as one who is exposed to beings and thus is himself a being. Nevertheless, it may be that this interest in truth, which can be alive even where there is no interest in logic, can, in the course of time, still be forced by the domination of logic into a quite definite direction and stamped with a wholly determined form. That is in fact how matters stand. Even where the question of truth does not stem from an interest in logic, the treatment of the question still moves in the paths of logic. In brief, then, from time immemorial, truth has been a problem of logic, but not a basic question of philosophy. This fact even bears on Nietzsche, and in the sharpest way, that is, precisely where the question of truth was especially raised in Occidental philosophy in the most passionate manner. For Nietzsche's starting point is that we do not possess the truth, which obviously makes the question of truth most imperative. Secondly, he asks what truth might be worth. Thirdly, he questions the origin of the will to truth. And yet, in spite of this radicalism of questioning, apparently never to be surpassed, the question of truth remains caught, even for Nietzsche, in the trammels of logic. What Heidegger is trying to make apparent in the previously read paragraphs is that the way in which the Western philosophical tradition has dealt with truth has always been on the basis of an understanding of truth as the correctness of an assertion, and that in that way it is bound to logic and to the way in which it has been established through the way in which Plato's and Aristotle's thinking affected the further development of Western philosophical thought. Now, I do not wish to defend Heidegger's claims in detail, but I'll simply try and give some more background that might help to understand the remarks he made regarding Nietzsche. Heidegger writes that even Nietzsche, even though he can be seen as the one who's most of the traditional Platonic understanding of truth, is still bound to the traditional understanding of truth as the correctness of an assertion. So, very briefly, Nietzsche has the idea that man, now that God is dead, can move beyond that the world and man are bound by a transcendental truth that lies beyond the sensory world, and that we have to try and reach in order to attain the internal truths. And this has always been God, but now that God is dead, man can, in fact, what Nietzsche thinks, become God himself. So he has also this idea of the Übermensch, or the overman, and the central capacity of the overman is to be the center of the universe, and from being the center of the universe, posit the values of that which is from his own, what he calls, will to power or will to truth. And this is not something that he receives from God or from something transcendental, but is from his own will, from his own consciousness, that man is able to posit the values of the world without any kind of external limitations. And this is a complete inversion of the traditional understanding of truth as something that we have to reach by getting outside of ourselves, by, for instance, with Plato, gaining access to the world of transcendental ideas. But for Nietzsche, it starts with man and his subjectivity. The fact that subjectivity is the starting point for truth, even for Nietzsche, who has been so critical of the traditional understanding of truth, is for Heidegger this sign that Nietzsche is still bound to the traditional understanding of truth and logic. This is because even for Nietzsche, truth is still grounded in a subject and its way of relating to an external world by an asserting. Only the difference is that the correctness of the assertion is not grounded in some transcendental truth, but in the positing of the truth of the subject itself. But the whole structure and the whole relational understanding of, on the one hand, assertion, on the other hand, the subject that does the asserting and the correctness that are tied up by propositional content is something that even Nietzsche does not move beyond. And this is also true for the other two philosophers that Heidegger names, namely Kant and Hegel, for who subjectivity is also the central basis for truth and a central basis for logic. And now the final two paragraphs of section 4. What is so wrong with that? For one, it could be that the perspective of all logic as logic precisely distorts every view of the essence of truth. It could be that the presuppositions of all logic do not permit an original questioning of truth. It could be that logic does not even attain the portico of the question of truth. These remarks at least suggest that the problem of truth stands within a long tradition which has increasingly removed the question of truth from its root and ground, and indeed that the question of truth has never yet been raised originally. Insofar as modern and contemporary thought moves wholly within the perspectives of this tradition, an original questioning of truth becomes accessible only with difficulty. Indeed, must appear strange, if not downright foolish. In these last two paragraphs, Heidegger gives a brief summary of the moves that he made in this section. So, he wants to try and go beyond the tradition with regard to the question of logic and truth. And he has given some indication of what he wants to go beyond. And based on my brief background of Nietzsche's thinking on truth, we could already say that it has to do with the place that subjectivity takes within the traditional understanding of truth and logic. Furthermore, we should keep in mind that the aim of these passages is not to develop detailed arguments already. It is merely to help us focus in the right direction and get us into the right relation to the ways of thinking that we will be traversing during the lecture course. With that said, I'll be continuing with paragraph 5. Paragraph 5. Discussion of truth by asking the basic question of philosophy, including a historical confrontation with Western philosophy, the need and the necessity of an original questioning. If, in what follows, we are not to discuss truth as a problem of logic, but instead are to question it while asking the basic question of philosophy, then, at the very outset, we will need to take into account these difficulties of understanding. That is, we will have to recognize that today the question of truth involves a confrontation with the whole of Western philosophy and can never be broached without this historical confrontation. A historical, in German geschichtlich, confrontation, however, is essentially different from a historiographical, in German historisch, reckoning of an acquaintance with the past. What a historical confrontation means should become clear in actually thinking through the question of truth. The question of truth, even if the answer is not yet forthcoming, already sounds merely as a question, very presumptuous. For if behind such a questioning there did not lie the claim to indeed know the truth itself in some sort of way, then all this to do would be a mere game. And yet, greater than this claim is the holding back to which the question of truth must be attuned. For it is not a matter of taking up again a well-established problem. On the contrary, the question of truth is to be raised as a basic question. That means truth must be first esteemed as basically worthy of questioning, that is, worthy of questioning in its ground. Whoever holds himself in this attitude as esteeming something higher will be free from all presumption. Nevertheless, seen from the outside, the question of truth always retains the appearance of arrogance, to want to decide what is primary and what is ultimate. Here, only the correct questioning itself and the experience of its necessity can forge the appropriate attitude. Before I read the last paragraph of section 5, I would briefly like to mention that it is very interesting here that Heidegger is so focused on trying to get us to understand how the questioning and asking a basic question is essentially connected with having a certain attitude. And at the first paragraph of this section, he mentions the distinction between, on the one hand, a historical confrontation and on the other hand, a historiographical reckoning. And this is going to be important later on, because what Heidegger is going to say is that an historical way of relating to the past is trying to really connect to the kind of experience that the people in the past had and how it shaped their way of relating to the world, whereas a historiographical reckoning is more about creating a system or a representation of the beliefs that a certain people held without really trying to engage with their experience of the world. And what must be stressed additionally is that the attitude of the historical reckoning is in its essence the same as what Heidegger means when he says that the question of truth must be asked by experiencing what is question worthy in the question. In both attitudes, it is about hearing what is being said. And by that I mean that with the historical attitude, it's about hearing the past and opening oneself to the past so that it can speak to oneself and in that way be able to experience what certain ideas or concepts meant within the lives of the people of the past. And that's also, I think, what is important in understanding what Heidegger means when he says that we must experience the question of truth from its question worthiness. That is also about opening oneself for what is question worthy and not trying to control it with already established ideas about what is important in the question. With this interpretation, we're also able to understand when Heidegger says, whoever holds himself in this attitude as esteeming something higher will be free of all presumption. So we're free from all presumption when we just open ourselves to be filled with what is question worthy, instead of using all the already established rigid ideas about what the question of truth is, and from there on only be able to ask the question in a very specific and narrow manner. And to me, this is one of the main reasons that the basic questions of philosophy is such an interesting published lecture course, because Heidegger is really trying to explain his methodological understanding of what it is to do philosophy. And for us, this is very important because only with a view of the methodological understanding of what he's doing are we really able to enter into his thought. And now the last paragraph of section 5. But in view of the tradition preserved throughout 2 millennia, how are we supposed to experience the necessity of an original questioning and of stepping out of the circuit of the traditional problem of truth and consequently the need of another sort of questioning? Why can we not and should we not adhere to the old? Why does the determination of truth hereto not satisfy us? The answer to these questions is already nothing less than a return into the more original essence of truth, which indeed must first be put on its way by our very questioning. Similarly, we can already convince ourselves by a simple reflection on the traditional concept of truth that here we have in hand something worthy of questioning which has remained unquestioned. In this last paragraph, Heidegger puts forward the very sensible question of why we should break with the tradition and why we need to change the methodological baseline of asking the question of truth. And he answers this question very interestingly, namely by saying that asking why the determination of truth unto here has not satisfied us is already asking the basic question of truth. It's already asking a basic question in the sense that it is breaking beyond the traditional rigid understanding of how questions and arguments within the field of questioning should be put. So by reflecting, by asking such a question, one is already transported outside of the structural way of dealing with these questions. And I think this argument can be made even stronger, especially when trying to argue against someone who says that the way the tradition is and the way that the tradition has dealt with these problems is because of the shared development of the understanding of these problems, and that it would be very unsensible to reject the development of 2000 years of philosophical thought. To someone who is critical of Heidegger's idea for the need of a basic questioning of truth, I think one should say that it is never a bad idea to re-examine from a neutral standpoint the question of truth, and that if the tradition has it right, then it will reach the same conclusions. But if it doesn't, then we should accept that maybe the tradition hasn't seen everything and that there might be reasons to indeed reject to some extent what has been developed over 2000 years of philosophy regarding the question of truth. With these final remarks, we've reached the end of this close reading session of Heidegger's Basic Questions of Philosophy. For the next session, we will start out with the recapitulation of what we covered today, and I will try and cover sections 6 through 9 of the preliminary part. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this close reading session. I'll be posting more in the close future, so until then, stay well and see you soon.